Welcome, this is Dave from Clausen Woodworks. Let's get into it. In this video we will follow along as we finish the top, assemble and paint the doors, and install the vanity in our master bathroom. For the top, I picked up some 6/4 maple. I started by cutting them to rough length, leaving an 1.5 inches extra in case I mess up, which I probably will. I tried to joint the face of the boards first on the 6-inch jointer, but the weight and length was just too much, plus some boards had some bad cupping. I cut them into smaller widths at the table saw first to make them more manageable. Jointing a face first, then an edge, moving to the planer to flatten the opposite face with help from my doppelganger, who keeps making my shop a mess, and then ripping to final width at the table saw. I marked for biscuits, and glued the boards together. Still had a bit of unevenness. I could have used cauls here to minimize the movement and require less sanding afterwards, but why would I do that? That requires less work. Sanded first with 80 grit on the belt sander to get rid of the bulk, going in continuous patterns to keep the top as straight as possible, checking for level as I go with a straight edge. In a few areas there were some small gaps on the top, so I mixed up some glue with shavings from the dust collector and filled them in. After sanding, I wet the wood to raise the grain and sanded again with 220 to prepare for finish.
I haven't worked with Vanity before, so I think this blotching is beyond me. Like, at first it looked like it was a little bit, I was like, okay, let's just use it as, I'll give it some more character, but this is pretty bad, and I do not. The other option was to go with a gel stain instead of a normal oil base. I wanted to go that route, but locally in the hardware stores, they didn't have any oil-based stain available. So they told me this would be good, it would stop the blotching, and it did not. So I did drive 1.5 hours to get this. A little bit of a darker color, but I'm hoping this will fix the issue using the gel stain. I will go over this again, sand it down through the grits, we'll get it to a nice smooth finish, and then reapply and see how it goes from there. If this is anything, it's a lesson learned, and I know from here.
The dimensions of this top are 73 inches wide and 22 inches deep. The cabinets measure 20.5 inches deep, plus the doors, so you're at 21.25 and 3/4 inch overhang. Next, I went searching for more maple to make the shaker panels. Same process to start. Cutting to length, leaving 1/2 inch extra, ripping to more manageable widths, jointing, planing, you know the drill. Ripping the pieces to exactly 1.5 inches wide and cutting them to their final length with the crosscut sled.
Finished cutting and milling all the wood for the doors. My only recommendation would be to always mill some extra wood. I thought at first I would have enough for this according to my measurements. But yeah, now we're going to continue. I got the setup for the doors here, so we're going to continue on the rotor table. I'm going to set that up with a rail and stile bit, but we're going to get to shaping these doors.
As one might do, I went to the interwebs and built this simple coping sled to make the process safer. I'm using the router bits from Bits and Bits, hashtag not sponsored, which are totally worth the money, if I must say so myself. For this build, I decided not to go with 1/4 inch plywood as the insert panel. I actually went with 1/4 inch MDF. And if you know plywood, plywood is always slightly undersized, but MDF is not. 1/4 inch is 1/4 inch. So having said that, the bits cut at just under 1/4 inch because it is set up for plywood. So what I did in my case, I actually ran the 1/4 inch MDF through the planer and took a small amount of material off. Now, I wouldn't really recommend this as this can be very hard on the knives, but I only had to run a few panels. The proper way to have done this would have been to purchase 1/2 inch MDF and run a rabbet around the outside perimeter that would act as a tongue that would fit inside the rail and stile pieces. The extra material on the other side would act as a backing on the inside of the panel to keep it flush for when you're mounting it to the drawer boxes. In my case, I cut extra 1/4 inch MDF to fit and added these pieces for the drawers. After allowing the glue to dry, I used a Craig door hinge jig. Having said that, we went with a 1.5 inch rail and stile, and the Craig jig is not set up for that. I ran a few test pieces and found that with a 1/4 inch spacer, I was able to get the hinge holes exactly center on the stiles without breaking through either side. Using another Craig product to add the door pulls at the same position on each drawer. I transferred a center line to the carcass, and using the Rockler hinge plate and a self-centering bit on the drill, I marked the holes for the door hinge plate. These plates had a small plastic insert where the screw would go into, so I enlarged the holes and put in the plate and drove the screws in. With some small adjustments on the door, I was able to get them straight. What I did was drill the holes first on the panels, and then take the panel and shim it to where it was needed, drive screws through the holes to hold it in place. Then I could pull it out and drive screws from the inside. This is a very simple technique for those times when you just can't get a clamp in there to hold the face in place. To make sure the drawers and the middle's reveals were all the same, I mounted the bottom one flush first, then the top one flush, and then divided the spacing in the middle to have an even reveal. To make the panels on the side, I used MDF. I only had one piece of 1/4 inch MDF left for the center panels, and of course I cut them too short. The plan was to route a rabbet on the back side of the panel, so I cut them to the exact size of the inside dimensions. It actually came out looking better than I had thought. Using this awesome 3M product, I taped off the top and inside the cabinets by the doors, using 3 coats of gray paint and 2 coats of water-based poly to seal it. For this project, I was spraying a latex paint. I did not thin it out, and my gun just couldn't handle it. It was clogging the nozzle, intermittently not spraying. So for the second coat, I thinned it out with water up to 10 to 15%, and it worked much better. Before moving the carcass upstairs, I took the measurements between the water lines and converted that to the carcass to make the cuts. Next, with the help of my brother, we wrestled this upstairs and in place. Used shims to make it level and shims against the wall for support. To install the backsplash, I put the top down in place and put the backsplash up against the wall. As no wall is straight, I used clamps on either end to hold it in place and then pushed on the backsplash as far as I could and marked it with tape on the top where it would sit. Used the tape as reference so I know where the backsplash would need to sit. Pulled it away and drove in the pocket holes from behind. Before finishing the install on the top, I drilled the holes for the figure eights using 2 on either side and 2 in the middle. Moving on to the sink install, I placed the vessel sink center of the doors. I grabbed the measurement referencing the edge, made my marks. Double check, triple check. You only want to cut this once. Using a Forstner bit for the faucet and a hole saw for the 1 3/8 inch drain. A tip here when using a hole saw, I always drill a pilot hole first on the edge, where my blade will intersect. This allows the saw to eject the shavings quickly and will prevent the bit from overheating. Allows for a faster cut as well. Placing the sink square to the front edge and attaching the pop-up drain nut to the bottom to secure it in place. Next, moving on to connecting the drain and water lines. Using black ABS, I like to always start by getting some close measurements while holding the pieces roughly where they should be. It doesn't have to be perfect. Make the cuts and then dry fit it first. You'll quickly see if you need to go back and adjust your pieces, always leaving them a little long if necessary. This glue sets up quick, always dry fit, and have a plan for the glue up. Here I chose to purchase threaded traps so you can swivel the input. With a solid option, I wouldn't even have been able to remove the drain spout that's connected to the pop-up drain afterwards, which I had to in this case as we changed drains and faucets, an option that only costed $1 more a piece. After installing the faucet, the second one did develop a leak internally, so we ended up replacing them to match the door handles and the light above. So we went with the oil rubbed bronze faucet and pop-up drain to match. Using the Craig jig again to install the hinges on the final doors, and adding the side panel, and on the inner panel just a few dabs of CA glue to hold it in place. And that wraps this project up. I hope you learned something or given you some ideas. If you have any questions or want to reach out, leave a comment down below, or if you have any input on any of the techniques I used, please give us some feedback. Hope you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing, and hope to see you in the next one. And I'm gonna rip the saw